He's a deputy editor for American Physical Society, and he will talk very interesting about communication in science, which is something we all scientists and engineers need to some advices. So very interested in this lecture.
Great. Thank you, Sylvia. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks you all for being here. You know, I know you had a heavy school, a long day probably, so thanks for staying up so late. Yes, I'm an electrical engineer, although I would say I definitely work much more in physics than in electrical engineering. But yeah, I did spend quite a bit of time engineering lasers and devices. So in this talk today, I will try to talk a little bit about communication and writing in particular. I'm really happy to do that for this quantum audience for a number of reasons. First of all, quantum is inherently difficult. You know, the eternal quote: if you understand quantum mechanics, then if you think you understand quantum mechanics, then you don't. It's a field where, you know, there is a lot of intersection between engineering and physics, so it's really important that we learn how to communicate between disciplines. There are also areas of quantum sensing and quantum computing that could have an impact beyond the field. And I'm thinking in particular about a field that I'm following a lot these days. It's the development of quantum gravity theories. And so it's a field where communication is really key, where communication is really hard. And so I hope that this talk maybe will give you some ideas early on in your careers, so that you can think about these aspects and try to write better papers, try to give better talks. So as Sylvia said, I'm actually now the editor, not the deputy editor, of Physics Magazine. It's a magazine, it's a popular magazine, I would say, by the American Physical Society, so the publisher of many journals that are relevant to you: Physical Review Letters in the first place, Physical Review X, now Physical Review X Quantum, and many other venues where you can publish your research. I also teach science writing and communication at NYU. I will talk a little bit more during my talk about what we do at Physics Magazine, just to give you an idea of where my messages come from, or, you know, how did I develop my perspective. And I'd like to start my talk with this idea, with this take-home message. So if you want to fall asleep and then forget about anything else, I think this is the one thing that I would like you to retain from my talk. And it is this idea that if you are a scientist, you have to consider yourself a professional writer. I interact with a lot of scientists from different fields, from different backgrounds, and I know how ready they are to do a lot of things for their profession. You know, they spend months learning how to use a new instrument, how to engineer a new device, how to learn a new code, a new theoretical tool to develop their models for the physics that they're studying. But I would say that few of them do the same with one thing that is an essential aspect of their careers, which is writing and communicating. I do think that your science will only matter if you're able to convey to your peers, to other scientists, physicists, and engineers beyond your fields, why what you're doing is beautiful, why it's important, what are the implications of what you're doing. So it's an integral part of your career. It's an aspect that you should treat very professionally. A lot of things don't think about that in a professional way. They think, you know, yeah, I will, at some point I will do it. They prepare their presentations last minute. They think that you cannot really improve your writing skills. You're either born a writer or not. And I would argue that that is not the case. There is a lot that you can do to improve the skills. They're very important skills. They will make you a better scientist. They will certainly improve your visibility in the community. So I encourage you to take this responsibility professionally. It's in your hands. It's something that you have to think about. And it's something that you can really work on and improve just by giving some thoughts to it. This talk may be a little resource. At the end of my talk, I'll give you some other resources, some things that I think are really useful to work on the skills. A lot of people, when I give these talks, think only about one thing. When I write, if I write well, I will publish more. This is to some extent true, but I would say there are many more reasons, and probably the reason of publishing is not a very good one. And let me explain a little bit. When you submit a paper for publication, at the end of the day, the people who are going to examine it are experts in your field. So they are people who really are working on the same things that you're working on, or very closely related things. So they will know the jargon, they will know the problem, they will know the motivation. You tell them what you did, they know the implications. So yes, the referees, they want a nicely written paper, but they don't need a very broadly accessible paper. But there are many, many other reasons where the writing can have an impact. And I'd like to emphasize a few of them. And the first one is to get cited. I do a lot of this analysis in my work. What are the most cited papers that we need to highlight, that we should have highlighted, maybe we missed. And when I read those papers, they have an invariable quality. Almost all of them are really nicely written, and they're highly cited probably because they're nicely written. So if you're a young student reading this paper, you got something from it, you're very inclined to cite it because you learned something from it. So there is a strong correlation, I think, between the quality of writing and the number of citations. And obviously, citations is one of the most important parameters to quantify your scientific impact. Things like the H factor, for instance, you probably have heard of that. A very important aspect that is affected by writing is to get proposals funding. When you submit proposals for a grant, you are talking to funding agents that are examining a really wide portfolio of activities. So they will not be experts in your field, and it's really key that you know your audience and you write your proposals effectively, so you can tell them why they should give you money. So I think that's a very important aspect. And the third point that I like to emphasize is interdisciplinary communication. There are many examples, I think, that I see and I anticipate where the fact that different subfields of physics and engineering coming together and talking to each other will be key to breakthroughs in physics and in science and in technology. And I can think of a few. Quantum computing is in itself a very interdisciplinary field. So it's quantum physics meets engineering, and there are many applied and fundamental directions that merge together. So I really do think that the progress of science is fostered by effective communication. So you have to enable somebody who is an engineer, if you are a physicist, or who is the physicist, if you are an engineer, to access a little bit your paper and to get the gist. And maybe they call you up to send you an email that will inquire. They will ask for more explanations, but you have to allow that level of access for the progress of your own field. And also, I think there is something hard to explain, but I recently talked to Brian Swingle. He's working on a project. It's called It from Qubits, and it's a project that is trying to develop theories of quantum gravity using quantum information theories. And one of the things we were discussing is that the very fact that he went to a school probably similar to the one you're attending today, and he had to explain his quantum gravity theories to people who had no idea. They were quantum physicists, quantum information scientists. They had no idea about gravity. The fact that he had to explain his theory to them was key for him to develop a new approach to his own research. So having to explain what you're doing, I think there is something in it that may really help you see new perspectives, see new directions. And I think it's really something that can enrich your research. And finally, I don't know what your plans are for the future of your careers, but communication skills are useful in any career path. If you want to abandon physics and go work for Google or anything, if you can communicate right well, it will be a great asset for your career, no matter what you do next. So a few words about what I am, what I did. I used to be a physicist and an engineer. I was building lasers for about 10 years. I essentially did this. it's a form of stroboscopic photography. A century ago, it was developed to try to learn how a horse is running and whether is flying at some point in his trajectory. In the 21st century, we're not doing horses, of course. We're doing atoms and molecules, and we're not using cameras. What I was doing was what we call pumpro spectroscopy, but essentially it's a way to get spectroscopic images, and with lasers you can do them basically as fast as you want. With today's technology, you can get down to attosecond regimes. So basically, you certainly can see any atomic movement in a material or in a liquid, and we are starting to be able to see even the dynamics of electrons. So something that's really fast. So that's what I've been doing for many years. I was a lucky scientist in terms of publications. I was a hot topic back then. I think the most important thing I did was a study on water, and I studied the most fundamental reaction in chemistry, the neutralization reaction where an acid gives a proton to a base. Probably have encountered it. It's important in biology, in everyday life, in industry. And we were able, using this very fast camera that we developed, to really time the reaction, and it was much faster than people anticipated, and that's why it was one of the highlights of the year for chemical engineering news. So I was working in this field. Everybody was expecting me to go on, become a professor, get some tenure position, but I had an experience that really changed my path ever since, and I went to work, and I did an internship in the European Commission. So basically, I was a physicist working alongside politicians, and I ended up doing that for several years. And I was the interface between science and politics in many different aspects, energy. You probably have heard of the framework programs of the European Commission. So basically, I was trying to translate the ideas of scientists so that politicians could take decisions, give money to appropriate projects, design the framework programs so they can fund meaningful research. And when I started this project, I thought, politicians are just very stupid, and we scientists, we are on a different level, and it's their fault if they cannot get why science isn't important and needs to be funded. But very quickly, my perspective changed, and I found that there were a lot of shortcomings on the side of scientists. And I remember one day when I was trying to help a scientist present the case for funding nuclear physics in Europe. And he had a few minutes in front of the European Parliament, and he didn't think he needed to be prepared. He think he's an incredibly good scientist, and he had published 200 publications. His age factor was 150. So he went up there, and in a few minutes he was able to say 4 times quadrupolar moment. Obviously, that wasn't a good way to connect to that audience. The thing didn't go too well. It was not just because of that, but I did realize through that episode, through the anecdote, that we scientists, we have the responsibility to communicate in a slightly better what we're doing, and to relate to our audience. So this made me reflect on this, and I decided to work on these aspects. And that's when I became the editor, or I was first the deputy editor. That's when I started to work for Physics Magazine, where basically what we're doing is we're trying to communicate physics to the broadest possible audience within the scientific community. So we're not a general public outlet. Our target are working scientists, young physicists, physicists from all fields, physicists from all levels of experience. And so it's a site I really warmly recommend if you want to stay up to date with anything that's happening in physics. It's also, I think, a very useful place where to look for how to communicate. I would say that the style that we're using is very similar to what should be, say, in user views in Nature, or in an abstract, an introduction in Nature or Science. So it's really, if you want to talk to any physicist, to any scientist, that's sort of the language that we're trying to propose. And I think it can be very useful for you to look at that and learn from that. So what are we doing here in this website? Let me just briefly say, because it's relevant to the thoughts that we'll give you about communicating. I think the most important thing that we're doing is we are highlighting the best science that we publish in the Physical Review. So what we do is we select the top papers. We think of the real breakthroughs, the big stuff, and we ask experts to write commentaries about those results. And just to give you a few examples, this was the discovery of gravitational waves in 2016. This was a paper, one of the latest papers by Stephen Hawking, trying to make progress on his black hole information paradox. In the quantum world, this was one of the final closures of the loopholes of experimental test of Bell inequality. I'm sure many of you have heard that. This was a commentary we wrote about the sort of the D-wave result back in 2013. They claimed to have developed the first quantum computer. Actually, our article was pretty critical of that finding. So this to give you an idea of the kind of things that we cover. So to do this, to find the science and to communicate the science that we think is the science that will change sort of history, we need two things. And we need to find it and we need to communicate it. So the next part of my talk, I will talk about how we do that. I'd also like to mention that we're trying not just to do this kind of expert reading commentaries, but we have a number of other things that we're doing in our journals, exploring new ways of communicating science. If you haven't seen it yet, this has been very popular. We're starting to use cartoons to communicate physics, and this was an incredible work by PhD Comics. You probably have heard of him, who explained the biggest physics result of this year, the mu on G-2 anomaly. I don't have time to go into these details, but working with him on this, it's one of the most incredible ways of communicating very complex physics in a way that everybody can follow. It's engaging, it's very active. So, but let's go back to the two things that I have to do for this magazine. I have to find the best science and I have to communicate it. And finding it sort of involves, I would say, answering 4 questions. I read hundreds of papers every week, and from each paper, I need to get these 4 questions. Why did they set up to do this research? What was the holy grail, the big thing that they were hoping to find? Then the open questions. What are the specific things that they are trying to solve? Let's say you want to develop a quantum computer that surpasses the ability of a classical computer. That's the holy grail of quantum computing. But in your particular work, you're probably addressing a particular thing. Maybe you're exploring the coherence property of a new architecture for quantum bits, for qubits, and you are solving some of the problems that lead to decoherence. So you want to give both the big picture and the more specific open question. Then a very important part, I would say the most important part, is the key result. What is really new? And this is something that really sometimes doesn't come across papers. What is the one thing that makes your paper different than anything that appeared before? And that's really key. That's what makes an editor want to publish your work. And finally, what are the implications of your result? This is the big shortcoming of many papers. They tell you what they did, what kind of experiments, what kind of measurements, but the implications of what they did may not be clear. They may be clear to them because they've been working on them for a long time, but you really have to articulate them. So you measure something, you developed a tool, you developed a device. So what? Why should we care? And I think that's an important part of your paper that you should really think about. And once we find the best science, then I work with scientists and I help them translate this science into something that's more accessible. So I've edited hundreds of scientists at all different levels. We start from very young postdocs all the way to very established science. So I work with a couple of Nobel Prize winners. So I really had that experience. Well, they send me a draft. I work with them. We try to restructure, to use the good language, and these are the experiences that I'm trying to collect in a sort of tutorial I'm giving today. It's usually a very good process. People are very happy to do that. They think they learn something in the process, but sometimes I get this sort of reactions. People are a bit resistant to some of our edits. The first says, simplifying too much, they will think I'm stupid. The second says, the scientist does not know what a Lyapunov exponent is. He and he should just go back to school. I don't want to waste time explaining it. And the third says, you've massacred my text once again. There is no way to explain this without Hamiltonian equations. So I think this are sort of very emblematic of the challenges that we have in science communication. And I try to collect some of them here. And I think the first one is the environment in which we operate and live and we are brought up in science. It's an environment that leads us to not realize who really is our audience. So we give talks, we think we're talking for our supervisors, for our competitors, for our colleagues. So we're talking to somebody who knows already. We can use jargon because everybody knows the acronyms, the jargon, the technical words. We're talking to impress our supervisor, to be evaluated by him. We're spending a lot of time communicating the how, how we did the experiment, how we did the model, how we did the calculations. But we forget all the rest. So I think that's really something that we should think about. When we are writing a paper, when we are talking and giving a presentation, we need to think about our real audience. So the third challenge is relating to the audience. So when you're doing these activities, try to think who is really out there, who is going to read my paper, who is going to be present when I give a talk, and try to have a realistic view of that. It's not just going to be your supervisor and your fiercest competitors. It's going to be much broader than that. So your communication has to address all of these categories. And the second example I gave before, this Lyapunov exponent, is probably what I call an example of the curse of knowledge. You work so much on something that you forgot how it was before you learn all those things that you learn in all those years of work. So it's really something that we have to fight. We have to try to remember how it was. We have to try to remember and relate to people who didn't go through the same path and may not know the same words and the same concept. So how to overcome these challenges, and this is a little bit what I'm going to talk about, a little strategy, especially focused on writing, of course, some general thoughts to start with. Write with the reader in mind. Again, you're writing physical review letters, physical review acts, science and nature. Every scientist should get something from it. So the reader is not a quantum scientist, the reader is a scientist, and you have to have that reader in mind so that you can communicate well to them. Practice, you can do a lot, you can improve a lot by working on your skills. I've seen people change very quickly, especially in the classes I'm giving at NYU. There is a process, there are resources that can help you. So really, you're not born with a talent for writing and communicating or not. You can work on it as much as you work and you learn things that you need for your research. And a third thing that I want to emphasize, if you want to learn how to write, the best writers in history are the best writer of fiction because they've read anything else. You want to learn how to write, you got to read a lot, and you will, try to read everything that you can from different fields, from beyond your fields. And when you encounter a paper that gives something to you, trust your instinct and try to learn something from it. What language are they using? How did they write the abstract? How did they write the introduction? How did they structure the paper? So read, and that would be a great asset for your writing. And also, for those of you who are not from the UK or the US or from a native, from an English-speaking country, something I really want to emphasize is that there is absolutely zero correlation between how well you speak English and how well you write. Writing is not about not making mistakes and getting the right grammar or the right words. Writing is about clarity, it's about logical flow. So when I started my job and I got a draft from a writer from Oxford or Cambridge, I was relaxed and I thought I would have very little to do because they speak very well, they will write very well, it will be very easy. On the other hand, when I would get a draft from a a scientist from another country, I would be more nervous. And very quickly, I realized that my thoughts had absolutely no reasons to exist. My favorite writers are not native speakers of English. Really, writing is not about grammar. Writing is not about not making mistakes. These things can be fixed. You can send it. There are companies that are doing this for a ridiculous price these days. The grammar can be fixed. The logical flow, the structure, how these 4 questions are presented in your paper, this is something that no editor without knowledge of the science can do. This is something that you have to do yourself. So writing is little to do with not making mistakes and with getting the grammar right. And in the last part of my talk, I'm going to talk about some structured approach to writing. And I do think that this approach, this is what I usually follow in most cases with my writers, with scientists I work with. It may not always go like this, but I would say that this is a way that can give you a good foundation. It works in most cases, I would say. And the first point is actually not writing, but finding the story that you want to tell. And I would say that this is more than writing. It's a brainstorming exercise before you're writing. So what is the story that you really want to tell with your paper? It has to be your unique story. It has to be a new story. It has to be a very clear story. Let me give you an example. It's probably a little extreme, but I want to contrast in particular storytelling with presenting data. A lot of papers just tell people what you've done, what you've measured, a series of experiments. I would say that maybe the majority of papers do that. This is an example from, more than half a century ago, DNA data. This is the X-ray diffraction pattern. This is presenting data. This is Rosalind Franklin's paper in Nature. This is just what you see if you shine light in DNA. But this is the story behind the data. Story was told by Watson and Crick. DNA as a helical structure. Of course, this has a lot of implications for how genetic information is transmitted and stored. So storytelling is really telling the story behind the work that you did, and that story, the elements of that story are exactly the 4 questions I was telling you before. What are you looking for? What is the goal? What is the specific question that you're trying to answer? And finally, after what you did, what are the implications? So a full story helps you find these elements and decide what elements are really needed to tell your story. And also something that I'm really convinced of, and I would say this is a mistake that many do. They write cover letters for editors, for Science, Nature, or Physical Review, whatever. And they are suggesting that the editor should publish their papers because of 6, 7 different reasons. Because you did a new device, because you tested some fundamental physics, and by the way, there's this little interesting thing about the noise, and 4th, something else about this device, the unique, the conditions in which it operates. I would say the additive property doesn't help you here. If none of these 6 or 7 elements is enough for an editor to publish your story, they will not publish your story. All you need is one story. And I would say if you're trying to tell many stories, you should write many papers. Your paper should be focused around a central story, the one point that you want to make, very clear to the reader, to the editor, to the community. And everything else should be instrumental to telling that point. And your story should be something that you could summarize it in a couple of sentences. This is some example. This is a probably quantum optics related thing, a good memory for light. A solid-state optical memory stores a light pulse and even a full image for more than 1 minute, the longest light storage time reported in any system today. So that's sort of a brief summary. This is a very useful way of telling your story. A great use of this sort of little summary is in the cover letter you're sending to an editor. Very quickly, at the beginning of the letter, you tell the editors what is your unique and new story. that you're going to tell. And then you give the other elements in the cover letter, but focus their attention on one point, on one story that you're trying to make. So you found your story, and then you need the elements to tell that story. And I would say the very most important thing is the story structure. And I would say this is probably, especially if you're not very experienced as writers, thinking about the structure is something that will give you the most benefits in the short term. You know, what is the structure that you want to follow? And one thing that I really recommend when you are writing is to use an outline like this. Use it to guide your writing. Keep it updated as you are writing your paper. And in the process, and in the process, it will help you see the structure. Is it flowing? Is it redundant? Or there are some parts that are told twice? It will help you really dissect the structure of your paper, the logical structure of your paper, and optimize it. And I would say, for most cases, this is what works. Some cases might be slightly different. If you're writing for the New York Times, you want a faster structure, but this is what works for most scientific papers. And I would say this reflects these 4 questions that I mentioned in the beginning. The context, the broad why, the big picture. The research needs a more specific why. What are the specific questions that you're trying to address? What we did, the core of the paper, of course, is going to be the specific things that you did, but this have to be selected based on the overall flow. Your presentation is not just a list of what you did. And finally, the implications. And I cannot emphasize enough, I read a lot of papers, and sometimes I get to the end of the paper and I have no idea of the so what. I have no idea why it matters. They told me they produce this device, this characteristics, these properties. So what? They don't spend enough time and words to tell me that very important piece of information. So try to really see the structure of your paper, have those 4 sections, highlight them, and then use an outline to present it. And that will be a very useful guiding tool for you. I have 10 more minutes, so let me skip to, well, let me first mention one important part of the structure of the paper are paragraphs. And I just want to mention briefly, you can, think about this, you can have my slides, and I'll give you some references, some books, and paragraphs are a very important thing. Paragraphs are, I would say, the atoms of the structure of your paper, and each paragraph should have a coherent unit of thought. Each paragraph should communicate one thing. And if it's trying to do more than that, you should probably break it up into multiple paragraphs. And an incredibly good strategy to write paragraphs is that of using point-first paragraphs. And these are paragraphs where there is a focal sentence that basically tells the reader, this is what the paragraph is telling you. It's a little summary. It's like a header or a title. And let me give you an example. This is a paragraph I took from LIGO's discovery paper, Gravitational Waves. The first sentence says, the basic features of this number is just that detection event point to it being produced by the coalescence of 2 black holes. So basically, this paragraph will argue that this signal comes from 2 black holes swallowing each other. And then the rest of the paragraph sort of motivates that sentence. It gives you all the details, all the numbers, all the derivation, but the key conclusion is right there at the beginning to guide your thought as a reader, so you can process all that detailed information. You already have the conclusion in mind, and you can sort of analyze these details with the guiding sentence. So this is a really important tool, I think, that is not used enough. And when you look at a paper that's written in a nice way, you can look at these focal sentences, and they allow you to do what I call non-linear reading. So you can highlight them and you can skip between different parts of a paper. You go back to this paper that you're reading a few weeks from now, you have those sentences, you can immediately go to the section that you need. You can immediately jump. And if you read them one after the other, you get an incredible, it's like looking at a paper from an aerial view from the top, and you can see the structure. You can see the algorithm that convinces you of the conclusions of the paper. So there's just one thought I wanted to share with you. Paragraphs are very important. And finally, the last 10 minutes of my talk, I want to talk about the language that you're using to tell your story. So you found your story, you develop structure to tell it, and then you should use effective writing strategies to tell the story. And some thoughts on this. This are connected to the challenges that I identifying before. The environment in which we work sometimes leads us to try to speak in an academic, scientific way. We speak in a stuffy manner. We use complex words just because we want to appear complicated. We don't want to appear simple. We speak to our supervisors. We want to impress them, but we don't have to try to do that. And another important aspect is economy. Sometimes, and I did this a lot when I started writing, to show that I was able to write, I was writing in a very convoluted way, using words that sounded good and striking to me. This is a quote from a great teacher of writing: "The secret of good writing is to strip every sentence to its cleanest components." So we have a founding principle in science called Occam's razor. If you have a theory that explains your data that's simpler than another one, you have to go for the simpler theory. Very similarly, for writing, the simpler way of explaining the same thing is always the best one. So a very important thing in writing is to cut everything that is not absolutely necessary. Every word that serves no function, every word that is complicated and could be simpler, every adverb that is not really needed there, you should cut those things and your paper will just gain in strength. Adding things that are not necessary doesn't add to the strength of your ideas. And some thoughts on how to reach that. This is just an example. I find it very often in the conclusions section of paper, there are sentences like this: "This work sheds new lights on the physics of nuclear or whatever the field of the paper is." That sentence is absolutely useless. Why? You're saying the work sheds new lights. Basically, it's telling you something new. What it's telling you, it's not said. It's telling you something new about a specific field, and by the time you're reading that section, you know that the paper is about that field, obviously. So basically, this sentence tells you this paper is published because we're telling you something new. That's what it tells. So and that's obvious because you're publishing it. So that sentence is completely unnecessary. But many classes of words and adverbs is one of them. They are really actually useless in most cases. Do you really need that to say that something is very large? What's the difference between large and very large? You need to say that you conclusively demonstrated something. If you demonstrated it, you demonstrated it. If you didn't demonstrate it conclusively, it was not a demonstration. So most of these adverbs are absolutely unnecessary. And I remember talking about this with a very senior editor at Nature, and she told me that what she was doing is every time she encountered very, she automatically replaced very with bloody in all the manuscripts that she received, and then she went through them and she edited out, of course, because you cannot use bloody in a paper. And her conclusion was that the paper was not losing anything by getting rid of that very. Jargon, we tend to use it a lot, and this is just a funny example, but I'm handling a lot of papers these days that are studying how birds migrate in the magnetic field of Earth, how they can be guided. It's a quantum mechanical effect. You probably have heard that idea. But many of these papers, they cannot say birds. They have to say the avian species. And why do they do that? It's just because they want to sound academic. It got me thinking when I first encountered this. I thought, maybe there is a difference. Maybe there are some birds who are not belonging to the avian species, or vice versa. But I would say if you can use an everyday word, if you can use a simple word as opposed to a combination of words, one word versus three, something that sounds simpler, something that we can all relate to. And I think this is just a metaphor for many things that we're doing in our writing. It's, many times we're deliberately looking to say avian species when we could just say birds, and say, just reflect about this and try to go for birds whenever you can. Active versus passive, this is sort of a little detail. Let me not go through that. Use short sentences. This is a sentence, again, for the sake of time, we'll just go quickly through it. I don't have time to process the content, but this is a sentence that's containing 3 or 4 ideas. You read it, you can barely breathe through it. And it's not just a matter of style, it's really, you have to sit down and think carefully about the logical connection between all the pieces of this sentence. And you can take a better look if you get my slides, but you break it down. This is the same sentence broken down into 3 sentences. It's much clearer what is the cause-effect relationships that underlies all the different pieces of the sentence. So do not try to make sentences long. If you're trying to convey more than 2 or 3 ideas in a sentence, you should probably break it up into multiple sentences. And these are some examples of clunky wordings that can be made much simpler. And there are subtle differences. Sometimes you can use the clunky version for the variety, but I would say, generally speaking, you should just go for the shorter option. It's almost always better. And overall, try to make your paper shorter. Try to eliminate everything that's not necessary. And a few words on the need to depersonalize science. We tend to write in a really impersonal way. And one thing that we're doing a lot is we're using passive voicing. We look at, this is one of the first papers by Einstein, habe ich gezeigt, I have shown. Back then, people were really using I and we. And I would say there is no reason to hide that we are behind our science. So there is absolutely, we shouldn't be ashamed of that. We should be able to use those words. So I would really, I know that many or some people do not agree with me, but I would say that converting I and we into passive formulations is not just bad style. Sometimes it's even ambiguous. It's unclear whether you did that or previous research or previous work did that. So using active voicing is really helpful. And I collected a few examples and personal or maybe fun or humor ways to present science. And I think when I find it, it's always a pleasure. It's always very useful. It's always very effective. Do not try to be as complex and sophisticated as possible. These examples I'm showing are all taken from Review of Modern Physics. So it's the highest impact factor journals for physics in the world, an impact factor of 45. So it's obviously a very serious journal. This is the title that was proposed, and the end title was Diabolical Conical Intersections. This is a paper that has been cited probably thousands of times, I don't remember well, but it's a very effective title. Conical intersections in chemistry are very complex things where the Born-Oppenheimer approximation breaks down. You cannot treat the lattice and the electron separately. Everything comes together. It's really hard to do this. The first title was trying to convey all of this in this very convoluted title. In the second, all of that was included in the word diabolical. So that was very effective. And some other things, I have observed that this Hamiltonian philosophy is like avocado, you like it or not. It's basically what Phil Morrison was trying to say is there are these 2 theories, this school of thoughts, and they're essentially equivalent. There is no good reason to go for one or the other. Very effective way to say this in a light way, in a way that we can immediately understand. And other examples like this, the flux from the star are changing on time scale that are short compared to your journal publication time scales. It was a fun way of conveying this. And I'd say when scientists try to do this in an elegant way, it almost always works. So keep that option in mind. Try to be personal. Use I and we. Don't hide yourself behind your science. You are the author of your science. And I'm concluding now with a few more ideas I want to plant in your heads about communication. One is about figures. Figures are very important. We think in terms of images, and I can tell you that many people, many editors, many journalists, many funding agents, they read a paper through the figures. So a very good tip is build the figures and the caption effectively. So go through your paper and try to present your paper through the figures and through the caption. Do they give a coherent story? And if not, you should probably change that. So focus on the figures. Maybe in a last step, when your paper is almost ready, try to dissect and analyze them separately. Are they effective or not? Are they simple enough? Are they giving a logical presentation of the work? And the other concept I'd like to introduce, something went missing in the slide, but it's the concept of multiplicity. So I said, you are not talking for your competitors. You're not writing for your competitors. You're writing for a much broader audience, but you're also obviously writing for your competitors. So multiplicity is this idea that your paper can address different people, can communicate to different levels, and you should analyze your paper accordingly. So there are some parts, the abstract and the introduction, I would argue that any paper in the most specialized journal should try to address every researcher, no matter what the background. It should try to have some elements that give them a sense of what you're doing. And then, of course, you go into the depth, and maybe you start talking to researchers in the related fields. And finally, the core of your paper, of course, your experiment, your simulation, your engineering tricks, only people working in the field can appreciate that. So there will be sections that really nobody but the most expert can access. And a good metaphor to explain this is to give your paper a hourglass structure. Your paper should be a hourglass. It should start broad, addressing many people, get narrower, and then broaden up again. Remember to broaden it up again. Remember to give the implications of the work in the last section of your paper. That's a very common shortcoming of scientific papers. And this is really my last slide. And I like to summarize some of the principles. And I'm going to use a little handwritten memo by one of my country's favorite writers, Italo Calvino. He was going to give this series of lectures at Harvard. It's a very prestigious series of lectures given not just by writers, but thinkers, sometimes musicians. I remember Herbie Hancock gave one. Calvino was trying to give 6 ideas, 6 principles that should inspire the writer in contemporary literature. And I would say that these ideas can be translated into the writing of the paper. And these are the ideas that he selected, and I totally agree that this should be founding principles of writing. Lightness. You have to write as simple and as light as possible. Don't try to be convoluted and complicated. If you can say birds, don't say the avian species. Quickness. Your paper should be as short as possible, without losing precision and accuracy. Everything that's not absolutely needed, you have to cut it, and your paper will gain in strength. Exactitude. Your paper has to have flawless logical flow. It has to be an algorithm that convinces the reader of your conclusion. So work on the structure of your paper, use an outline, design it, analyze it, improve it, remove redundancies, remove jumps where you don't see the logical connection between parts of your paper. Visibility, think about the images. Figures are a very important part of your paper. Multiplicity, your paper should address different category of people, and think about the hourglass metaphor. Start broad, go narrow, and remember to broaden up your paper again at the end. Calvino unfortunately died before giving the last memo, the last talk, and we don't know what he would have written. He didn't write that one, but we know the title. It was Consistency, and that's my take on this. Let me remind you what I said at the beginning. If you are a scientist, you're a professional writer. So take this responsibility as an integral part of your profession. And I'm not arguing to, do classes, workshops, schools. But what I'm suggesting is that you just think about these aspects every time you do it, every time you give a presentation, every time you write a paper. Do it consistently, and you will improve constantly. And in the process, you will find that your papers, your talks, they will start to have your own voice. They will convey the clarity of your thinking, and it will convey the passion that's behind your science. So do it consistently, you will find yourself in your writing will become easier, more enjoyable, and it will be a big asset for your career. So with this, I'm concluding. If you look at my slides, I'd like to give you two sources of information that can help you. The first is freely accessible. It's a part of a review of modern physics style guide. It has an appendix called Writing a Better Scientific Articles. It has many specific examples, especially those clunky phrases that can be simplified and things like that. I think it's a really, really useful resource that everybody should take a look at. And finally, this book, it's a great book with a compelling title, How to Write Papers That Get Cited and Proposals That Get Funding. I think it's a very enlightening book, and I do warmly recommend that people read it. And with this, I'm gonna thank you for being here so late. It was really a treat to be with you today, and yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. So thank you for your attention today.
Thank you, Matteo. I think this was very interesting talk, and I think if you agreed to be on the website, then we will still keep
Sure.
so people will still access this important information. And I also thank you also for the last book, because many of us are kind of early research scientists and always very involved in writing proposals, and I think most of your advices might be also applied for writing proposals and for making proposals more appealing. Is there any question?
I also wanted to mention that I see that Stoyan Rebic is an editor of Physics Review X Quantum, is joining us in case there are some questions that are more specific to editors. So he was very happy.
Hi, Stoyan. Thank you for joining. I was afraid I saw the that I didn't want to ask explicitly. So okay, so maybe I can make a question about from the editor part. So I mean, sometimes there are kind of two different approaches in writing a paper. Sometimes you wait until you have like every result and you think your research is finished, even though we know that there is no such a thing like a research to that end, because it never ends. And then sometimes you might have some preliminary result, and then you might want to publish them. So just it's a very generic question, but from your point of view, what is a good approach? Is it okay to write some preliminary results and then leave some open window in the conclusion, saying we might I don't want to say like this is a result and then we'll open new frontiers and so on, because but something like that.
Yeah. Well, this is a very good question. Thank you for this question. I would say that both approaches are actually very legitimate approaches, but where you are going to submit and where you are going to get your paper published, it depends on your approach to it as well. So if you have more of a preliminary result, if the result is strong and indicates something strong, you may try to publish it in a high-profile journals. But I would say that for the high-profile journals, you actually need a real result. You need a finished research that shows something in particular, while the preliminary result can be perhaps left to a more incremental publications. Having said that, one of the advices that I can give to every young researcher, I think, is that at a certain stage of your research, when you have some preliminary result, it is always a good idea to write the first draft of a paper. Because in writing this first draft of a paper, you are forced to think about it, you are forced to think about how to formulate it, how to present it to the wider audience. And this on its own may give you further ideas of how to proceed with your research. And then you pick up writing later on if you have more results. So this is something that I would advise everyone. Yeah.
Thank you. And
if I can add to your comment, I think that's really great what you said. And from just my more writing center perspective, there is a whole school of writing that's called Evolutionary Writing. It was taught by Mark Buchanan and another. He was an editor at Nature. And his idea was that the writing of a paper is similar to evolution. So it's basically you start putting down your ideas, you write an initial draft, and then you have sort of mutations, you have changes, and sometimes these changes are not, most of the times they're not successful or they don't lead to dramatic changes, but sometimes in the process of writing and gathering your idea, there is a phase transition and you realize, oh, actually the story that I want to tell is something else. And so there is sort of a genetic jump and you go to a completely different state and maybe to a much higher impact result. And then you can decide, okay, it's time to, let's focus on that new approach and let's publish something that's higher impact than a preliminary thing. And also as a general comment, I think we should all try to stop this publish or perish philosophy. So I would say, we should publish really what's essential. So don't just try to do it for the sake of publication. But obviously there is an argument, maybe the preliminary result is helpful because people know about it and so they can work on it and help it make it less preliminary. So it's always a subtle thing. It's your judgment on whether
it also depends, I guess, on the state of development of the field, because in some fields, if researchers are stuck at a certain point and you suddenly have a preliminary result, just a preliminary result, which may help others get better ideas and overcome the stalemate that the field is in, it's worthwhile publishing. It's always worthwhile publishing in that case. So it's really a decision depending on the case. We often say in our editorial office that the most generic answer to all editorial questions is it depends. It is always a specific case that we have to think of and deliberate upon.
Okay, Julia had a question. Thank you for the lecturing tips. What is your favorite papers?
Wow, I would have to think a bit about this. Yeah, it's hard to give the reference. I remember, some papers. Well, I would say, for instance, LIGO, the Observatory for Gravitational Waves. They are great communicators, and you can see if you look at their announcement, if you look at their papers, they're very simple, very to the point. They don't try to make it look more complex than it is. So I would say their papers, almost all of them, whenever it's signed by the LIGO collaboration, they have a pretty good style. I'm thinking specifically about quantum computing, quantum sensing. I have a couple of thoughts. I think that one for which I summarized it in a story, the first time that they achieved 1 minute of light storage in medium, that was a well-written one. But I actually have some notes on some great paper that I use as an example. Maybe I can, post them somewhere. And
okay, that would be great. Yeah, if you send to us, and then we will forward. Okay, I will stay with you for another couple of hours, but probably it's time to go.
I have a very quick,
Paula,
which is a little bit related with what you asked, Silvia, which is the following: how much space should we give actually to further developments? I always have this problem, in the conclusions of the paper, and how much space to give for describing what, in my mind, in our mind, in the mind of our group, are the possible future developments. And I never know, because I don't know whether, explaining exactly where we want to go from there, it might be slightly, how to say, it could cut possible ways that we are not able to see and other will be able to see. And I don't want to do this. So I don't know. I mean, what do you think about it?
I'm not sure I heard the last part. Was saying you may not want to give tips to other people on what to do.
No, but not because I'm jealous about them, but just because if I suggest too much, I might inhibit different views on these results that might be very helpful and that perhaps I can't see, you know.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I find, and maybe Stoyan has more to say on this too, is that a lot of times people feel, I would say most of the times they don't do it enough. Like there are some papers where this aspect is absolutely ignored. They just say, oh, we did this device, these are the properties, that's it, stops there. And I think that's really too little. But there are also many cases where people just feel, oh, now I have to talk about future developments and I have to put some ideas there. And these ideas are very vague and sometimes they're not very accurate or not really directly related. Sometimes they're exaggerated and they claim to be related to solving big problems and you cannot really claim that. So my suggestion is to be just very honest, like to really where you think this work can lead to, and if you're worried that you might limit the sort of the attention or the approaches that come after you, you can even say that. You can say, this is one thing that we feel or we suggest, or again, you can be more personal. I think it doesn't have to be to sound like this is the only thing that you are proposing. So my suggestion is to be very honest, but also concrete and really, again, the inspiring principle should be what's necessary. So what you really think is necessary for the reader to understand the implication and to think about possible future developments. So don't do it just because you feel you have to if you don't think it's useful. And so maybe you want something more concrete.
I completely agree. When you're giving, at the end of every paper, I think you're right, you need to say a few words about where you expect this research to lead. And in that you can only really write what you think or where you can see it leads. It doesn't necessarily mean that someone else can see something else in it and take it in a different direction. As a scientist, we do that. In fact, actually, just related to your question, I would like to emphasize that in our journal PRX Quantum, we have actually a specific publication type or article type for this type of articles. It's called the perspective, where the authors, it's usually invited by the editors. The authors are supposed to give a short outline of a certain field of development, but the most of the paper should be about where the field is going, what are the outstanding problems that needs to be solved, and what are the possible ways of going around these problems. And it is well known, we put it in all of our policies and practices, that these papers are essentially personal view of the authors and has to be taken as such. So yes, we definitely value personal views of the authors and would like you to share them with us.
Thank you.
I think, again, this is the general idea of you can be more personal. You can be yourself. You can really say what you think and you don't have to make it sound as if universal. These are the implications that and the only ones they can follow. And also maybe connected to that sentence that I had, avoid this vague statement. This paper sheds new light on the quantum physics of this. These things are not really useful. Try to be quite concrete in what you outline there.